What are the limits of your ideas? If you're truly open-minded, where do you draw the line between being open to a concept and regarding it as a false premise with no need for further investigation? The philosopher Nietzsche said that there are no facts, only observations. And I've kind of liked this idea because, truthfully, everything that we know about this world around us is based on observation. The entire basis of science is observation. It's an extremely powerful method of analysis, but Heisenberg said, no, not the Walter White one, the actual Heisenberg said, that the very act of observing disturbs the system. Interestingly enough, the entire basis of modern society, specifically countries who reformed or were founded after the early 1700s, is based on this philosophy of the Age of Enlightenment. For those unfamiliar, as I once was, it is the time period the great minds and thinkers of that era believed that any problem humanity faced could be solved with science and reason rather than traditions or faith. When you read up on this Age of Enlightenment, the events leading up to the founding of the United States and the centuries after it make so much more sense. For the life of me, it never quite registered as to why a God-fearing and God-loving society could ever eradicate, that's a fancy way of saying murder, so many Native Americans. And before I go any further, I want to point out I am not trying to convert anybody to any religion here. This is an analysis of science and spirituality. Now granted, the diseases brought with the settlers contributed greatly to this eradication. But when you consider that the New World settlers were embodying this so-called forward-thinking ideology of the rejection of tradition and respect to reason and science into every aspect of what their new governing body could be, it's no wonder that the Native American society that believed strongly in a connection to the natural world was viewed as primitive. But let me ask you something. If this new way of thinking was so great, why did it take almost 250 years after the founding of the United States to consider the idea that climate change and taking care of this planet was an issue? Meanwhile, the Iroquois nation had an oral treaty that dates back to the 12th century that talked about the principle of the 7 generations. For those unacquainted with the 7 generations, it's this understanding that when you make decisions about society, that you take into consideration the next 7 generations. Specifically that you leave them a plentiful world that's resource rich. Of significant importance are things like water, forests, food, ecosystems. Why did it take science until the 1970s to determine that taking care of our planet was a priority when the Native Americans, specifically the Iroquois, who operated on a spiritual belief system, had long since decided it was a priority, predating science in its belief by roughly 800 years? It's a baffling question. How was science so late to the party? And in typical science fashion, it wasn't fashionably late. Perhaps we could argue that science was preoccupied with the notion of can we rather than should we, as well as caught up in solving whatever trendy problem arose, such as building an atom bomb. Thanks, Oppenheimer. Though I don't fault science. It's the very nature of it, actually. Science is observation-based, meaning until there is observable data, no theory will be taken seriously unless you have Stephen Hawking level of credibility. Not only that, but it's just super difficult to convince people when you have an idea that's outside of what they deem as normal, or what they've always viewed. Convincing people is no easy task. And before I go any further, I do want to specify that I'm a huge supporter of science. My first love was space and NASA, and learning about all of these amazing ideas that are out there that we're trying to prove. And I love science for what it does. I love that science waits until the evidence is conclusive. Specifically, my comparison here is, how did something so spiritual beat science to the punch by such an extreme amount of time? It kind of got me wondering a little bit. And remember how I said that Nietzsche, the philosopher, had a quote that facts are just observations. I do want to point out that he was not religious. Okay, so that's pretty important to denote. But he did grow up with a father who was a pastor, and his father died at the age of 35. And so it kind of sent him down this spiral of wondering about this world around him. It made him lost in the spiritual sense. But the only real difference between a theory and a scientific principle is the observations to prove the scientific principle. And that's a really profound thing, because there's nothing to say that the Iroquois nation's spiritual belief about taking care of 7 generations wasn't observation-based. So now I want you to think with me for just a second. If the Iroquois nation's belief about the 7 generations was observation-based, does that mean that their spirituality was rooted in a little bit of a science? And I'm not trying to blur the lines between science and spirituality here. It's just kind of a very interesting observation that I see, where we could say that the Iroquois nation, because of the truths that they were seeing around them, were able to denote certain characteristics of the world that they needed to take action on. And that's not really much different than the way science approaches things. And it brings up this very interesting thought. How often do spirituality and science reach similar conclusions? And the first thing that comes to mind to me is this idea of yin and yang, where spirituality and science are kind of different and opposing forces in a sense, but within the yin there is the yang, and within the yang there is the yin. Those little dots inside each of them are a little piece of the other side, and that's vitally important to humanity, and I'll tell you why that's important. So if you think about the Dark Ages of Christianity, we know what happens when a religion is the ruling and divine force in life. It leads to intellectual stuntedness, where we're not really growing as a culture in certain senses, and we kind of bind ourselves to ideas that have always been thought of before, rather than expanding our minds. But what happens when science becomes that exact thing? So, in essence, think of this idea of, could there be a dark age of science? And when I say it like that, it sounds very doom and gloomy, but the appropriate word that I'm looking for is dystopian. Now, dystopian novels have existed for a long time. My favorite, being The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, is one that I highly recommend that people read because it's more relevant now than it has ever been before, and for good reason. In essence, I'm not the first person to have this fear of a technological dark age, not by a long shot. But I want to ask the question specifically, at what point do we realize we might be living in one? And I don't know that I have the answer to, is this a dystopia or not, but I want you to think about this as a thought experiment for just a second. We share our information on a dozen or so platforms on the internet. And these algorithms can control how information is shared via people. And an algorithm could be set up to exclude certain results for certain types of people, so that people are getting different information. And a really easy way to kind of tie this back to the subject that I've had at hand today. Say you have like a 15-year-old kid that's struggling with something like spirituality, and they Google something that says, is God real? Now, if you do that Google search, if you Google, is God real, it is going to give you the most relevant results to your question. But it doesn't take into consideration the ethics of shattering somebody's spiritual beliefs, because I have made that search before, not for my own personal reason, but out of curiosity to see what it would say. And it leads you inevitably to a post that says, we don't think so, here's all our reasons why. And is it really Google's place to be able to shatter somebody's spirituality? And the reason that I find that to be relevant is not necessarily because I subscribe to those belief systems, but because I respect the fact that everyone has the right to believe what they want to believe, and it's not up to us to tell them how to believe. Because you know what, if it works for them, then that's great, because you know what, most religions actually teach very positive values. And yeah, there's some things that I would disagree with that they teach, but that's with anything, with any point of life. You're not going to agree 100%. Even when you're talking about things like politicians, you're not going to agree with every issue and every stance that they take. And who are we to determine someone else's spirituality? And the reason that I ask that question specifically is because if you think about this Iroquois nation, how different would our world be today if we had taken some kindness to their point of view about providing for the 7 generations to come. I like to think our world would be so much better simply because it makes the world much more than just about today. It makes the world about tomorrow and about taking care of our children and our children's children and their great-grandchildren. It makes us stop and consider that maybe this point in time isn't the most important one, that all humans are connected in some form or fashion. The idea of the 7 generations isn't a lone standing belief. It's part of a much bigger oral constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Great Law of Peace. It was a system of governments based on peace, unity, and consensus building, and it's believed to have influenced the development of American democracy, which is what makes this whole thing absolutely fascinating. Because Benjamin Franklin and James Madison were well aware of this oral constitution, and perhaps they couldn't convince their peers that this idea of the 7 generations was important, but they specifically didn't include it because in the age of Enlightenment and the age of reason and scientific basis, you can't include things that don't have scientific grounding. And so it really is kind of an interesting thing when you look at it that way, because one thing about humanity, whether it's science or whether it's religion, mistakes are bound to happen. And this painting is a prime example of that. That's Regretful Purple number 1. I knew as soon as I put it on the canvas, it was the wrong shade. But I tried to see things through because I was learning how to use a palette knife for this video. That was my goal, was to just grow a little bit. And interestingly enough, I had recorded an entire other podcast for this video. And that was the main thesis of it, was mistakes. And how we're supposed to try and grow and learn from them. And the really weird thing about making mistakes is that when you realize you're in the moment making a mistake, you kind of just try to see it through and hope that it'll work out for the best, but you really don't know how it's gonna go. And sometimes you spend so much longer trying to fix a problem than it would take to just start over. And that's exactly what happened for me here. I spent a ton of time trying to fix this in any way that I could. And I'm not just talking about the painting, I'm talking about my video and my podcast, because I quickly realized as I was posting some of my other videos that people weren't tuning in past the introduction. They weren't even getting to the core concepts that I was discussing in my videos, and that's a large reason why I've created this channel. So you've essentially reached the actual introduction, because I thought I would try something a little different this time, where I started with kind of the conclusion and then slowly worked my way into showing you how I got to that idea. So welcome to Signs of Life. This is a painting that was meant to be about symbolism. And it's based on a real image I took in Aurora, Colorado, which is where I attended school for a little while and studied film a little bit. And one of the big concepts they teach in film school is symbolism, which is showing people an idea subliminally that they might only pick up on later if they analyze it. When I started creating this painting, I thought it was going to be a linear process. I thought I was going to pick up the palette knife and make something that was good enough that I could just talk a little bit about the symbolism. But I didn't realize that I was going to have to scrape off some paint and start again. And although I was kind of enjoying it, I wasn't really sure I was going to be making a video with this footage because it just wasn't really working out. I mean, I was getting some interesting textures, but it was nowhere near what I was going for. So I thought I might just practice a little bit. And I loaded the paint knife differently. I decided, you know what? I'm just gonna do whatever I can with this, and if something comes of it, cool, not a big deal. Because, life's too important to be taken seriously. Not everything that you do in life is going to work out perfectly. In fact, most things don't. You can plan all you want to plan in this life, and very rarely do things go exactly how you plan them. But the funny thing is, as I started playing around, I started seeing some shapes that I was liking, and so I got a little more bold with it and started sliding the knife in different ways. I thought, this is going to be a really fun piece to just kind of finish out regardless, because it doesn't matter what it looks like at this point because it's already a failure. And the beautiful part about recognizing when you fail and just kind of seeing things through is that the result matters so much less. And it really just becomes more about figuring things out as you go. And that's just it. Life really is just figuring it out as you go. Sure, you can have some great mentors in this life. One of the greatest mentors of all time is Bob Ross. I mean, he teaches you just to find the joy in painting. And I've seen so many beautiful pieces that have been created with a palette knife that I thought maybe I could make something too. And I was really just scraping on paint hoping that it was just gonna work out. But I guess I realized through all this that that's essentially where most people started. They were just kind of testing the waters. I think so often in life we compare our step 1 with everybody else's step 1,000 instead of just realizing that at some point they probably started exactly where we did, where they had no idea what they were doing, but they did it anyway. It reminds me of the adage, comparison is the thief of joy. But I would like to say that comparison robs us of joy, because in the expression that it's the thief, it focuses on comparison being the villain. And comparison is the villain, but when you say that comparison robs us of joy, it reminds you of something that you had that was taken away. And to build off of that, when you consider a mistake and you use it in the form of comparison, you're discounting the value of your mistakes. I mean, there's another famous expression about Thomas Edison and 10,000 light bulbs and 10,000 ways to not build a light bulb. But I think that kind of discounts the fact that, yeah, he may have figured out 10,000 ways to not do it, but the lessons learned in the mistakes are what inevitably led him to creating what he was initially setting out to make. Or at least something close to it. For me, in this painting, this is not what I was setting out to make, not even remotely. This was going to be a very simple discussion about symbolism in life, in paintings, the meaning that we can derive from the meaningless. And I wanted to kind of show the beauty in that, and that sometimes it's okay to just think about things in a poetic nature. But this almost became poetic as I was making so many mistakes that I created something entirely different than what I began with. And as I was starting to kind of see it come together at this point in the painting, I went, you know what? I'm gonna have fun with this. So I started adding in some little dashes and dots of colors, because for me, it was just like, how far can I take this? How far can I push what I was making and then unintentionally made? And the beautiful part is, when you free yourself of expectation, it's hard to disappoint. And what you have to realize is, the journey that you are on in life is the one that you are meant to take. And that's not to say you don't have free will. That's not saying this in a spiritual sense or in a fatalist sense where you are bound by destiny and fate. It's more saying that the lessons that you learn in this life, the hardships you face, are going to shape you. And it's vitally important that you let it shape you in a positive light. Don't let darkness be the sculptor of your mind and your ideas and general attitude about this world. Because if you're shaped by darkness, that's all you'll ever see. But if you're shaped by the light, when it's dark, you will see the stars. You will see the moon. And you will be reminded of how beautiful this world truly is. One thing that science has done to us, and basing our culture and our worldview around science and reasoning, is that it tries to explain away all the beauty. When really, the beauty of a sunset, though we can explain why the colors show up the way they do, is kind of irrelevant for why a sunset is beautiful. And I mean that in a philosophical sense, like, we don't really need to explain the bounds of physics and how lights refract in certain ways. But rather, I find it more important to get lost in the light, and the colors, and the wonder. Because life is so full of wonder if you just open your eyes. See what's out there. See what's around you. It's beautiful. And it's all waiting to be taken in. So, if you're lost in wonder, saying, how did we get from this painting to talking about the Iroquois nation and the 7 generations? Well, it was all an accident. I took a picture one winter's morning, and caught the reflection of my own staircase in the glass. And it seemingly created this stairway to heaven, which got me thinking about the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, which is a song about enlightenment. And I kind of started going down this rabbit hole of learning about enlightenment and what it is. I derived meaning from the meaningless. And eventually I landed on learning about the Enlightenment age, which I didn't know this, but is a large part of the reason that the United States ended up coming to be. And to call it the Enlightenment age makes it sound like they had everything figured out. But one thing about being enlightened is that it means to be free from ignorance and misinformation, showing understanding and wisdom in dealing with others. It often involves being open to new ideas and facts based on reason and compassion, rather than adhering to outdated beliefs. Now, while a lot of the philosophies that ended up founding this country were rooted in a lot of those things, they ignored a pretty basic idea that the Native Americans had about taking care of your own home. In other words, taking care of your planet. And so it makes me wonder what else they missed. And then I realized that a lot of our Constitution in the United States is based off of the Native Americans' own Constitution, the idea of a democratic republic, the idea that we would base our enlightened thinking off of a spiritual group and their Constitution is almost ironic. And it kind of becomes bizarre when you think about it in a broader context of ever since that point, we have slowly moved towards rejecting anything of the spiritual variety. And so if you're wondering how I got to needing to talk about that in the beginning of this video, it's because I realized that the only reason I ever learned any of this is because I was willing to find meaning in the meaningless. Meaning, I wasn't necessarily looking for meaning simply for my own benefit. I wasn't trying to, read the stars and find my sign or, read a horoscope. It was about entertaining an idea that was so much bigger than myself. And when I did that, it kind of helped the whole picture start to come together. Because one thing about life, it really is stranger than fiction. And your journey goes exactly the way it's meant to go. We often talk about signs in life. But what if those signs weren't mystical pronouncements, but rather subtle echoes of our own actions? What if we get stuck in a feedback loop simply because we're not taking feedback from the world around us? To clarify, this isn't about superstition, it's about observation. It's about recognizing the patterns that emerge when we pay attention to the seemingly insignificant details of our lives and what they might tell us about ourselves. Or even the thoughts we can derive and the meaning we can find so long as we're looking to grow and self-reflect. And that's essentially true for this video and this painting. My first iterations of it were complete and utter failures and mistakes. But because I was willing to see things through, because I was willing to keep moving forward, it eventually became what it is today. And not to say that it's this perfect iteration, but it's certainly an improvement. And progress really does equate to happiness. My whole concept behind this painting was to create something that had so much symbolism and was so easy to understand that a 5-year-old kid could understand the meaning. And at the same time, I didn't want to have to spell it out, but I really wanted to play on this principle of finding meaning in the meaningless. And truly, what's more meaningless than just a stoplight? I mean, what's more meaningless than just a crosswalk? They're everywhere. And I decided I wanted to use the idea of minimalism and maximalism to create a focal point, utilizing minimalism in the streets so that your eye was drawn to the sky where all the colors were. And you can say, yeah, these are just street lights, but you can also look a little bit deeper and you can see something more. In essence, if you want to find meaning in something, you can, but you don't have to. I found for me that finding meaning in something led me on a journey of understanding, a journey of wanting to know more, to let my curiosity run wild. And I hope that something about this video or this painting really inspires you to get out there and go walk. Go see the world. Go experience nature and life, and go find your connectedness to this world. Because if you're just staying inside all the time, you're going to miss out on a lot of the beauty that's out there. And it's only because 5 years ago, I went on a walk and I took a picture of something seemingly meaningless that I was able to derive any of this meaning. Everything in your life will go exactly how it's meant to go. Thank you for tuning in.